who's haven't been relieving pressure. I see they've been missed passes.
The execution not quite there, not as sharp as you'd like it to be.
Steal the puck here and try to spring Tippett again. He's got it. Oh, and Tippett in on goal again. The backhander, he scores! Persistence pays off for Owen Tippett. And his drought is over, and this game is tied at 1-1.
Great job by Forster to intercept that play in the defensive zone. And look at this backhand. I mean, you got pressure coming down on you. He tried it at the forehand before, keeps it to the bat, and now as a goaltender, you're thinking, no way is he going to backhand this puck in. At some point, you're...
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah, and I'm here with Chef B, who's going to tell us about one of our sponsors here. Chef?
Yeah, O&B Puckcast is now brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. The winter months can be especially hard on our homes, from roof damage and peeling siding to frozen pipes and toilet overflows. Call Summit Public Adjusters before you call your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be stressful and confusing. Let Summit Public Adjusters take the stress out of the claim process by having our guys work for you. Get the most for your money and your repairs. The next time the big snow or the rain leaves you with some home damage, contact us for a free consultation. Summit Public Adjusters are licensed in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. Learn more at summitpublicadjusters.com or call 215-752-0560. Just tell them that the chef sent you.
Yeah, what was that number again, Chef?
215-752-0560.
That's terrific. All right, we're going to carry on with the rest of our show. And we are back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast. And this is an O&B special. I really look forward to this one. Yeah, we're recording this the night after the Flyers took down the Penguins in OT. The Flyers are 2-1-1 since our last show. But that's not going to be our focus tonight. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the big picture because the Flyers have 39 games between now, when we're recording, and the trade deadline. And because of that, I've identified about a dozen players who are kind of on that bubble that with an uncertain future with the Philadelphia Flyers. So just a reminder before we bring in Anthony DiMarco from the fourth period, we're brought to you by FlyersNittyGritty.com. You can rate and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, where you can find most podcasts. If you could subscribe, it really helps move us up the charts and the algorithm when you are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts. It helps us out tremendously. So especially on Apple and Spotify, we have a YouTube page. We're on Facebook. Just plug in there, O&B Puckcast. And, of course, we can be found on Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. And on Getter as an alternative at O&B Puckcast. So without any further ado, I want to bring in Anthony DiMarco from the fourthperiod.com and also Stick to Hockey Podcast, which is also another great show. Anthony, how are you?
Not too bad, man. Glad to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you along. You know, as I mentioned, the Flyers have X number of games between now and the trade deadline. And as much as we're kind of enjoying, and maybe on the other side of the ledger, there is some angst that the Flyers are doing too well. There is an inevitable feeling that on March 8th, the Flyers are going to do something to alter the team more towards a look toward the future. We saw that with Darren Drager, talking about how Briere has come out and more or less said, hey, I want to be a wheeler dealer. And then, you know, Danny Briere comes out on Snow to Goalie in a pregame show and said, yeah, that's kind of true, you know. So I just identified some players. But before we get into that, what's your overall feeling about the team, where they're at from that perspective?
Well, I think what Dreg said is 100% bang on, and something that was reiterated from Danny Briere on Stowe the goalie, as you just mentioned. But I don't think this is anything like new to us. Like we know that Danny Briere and the Flyers brass, Keith Jones as well, have been looking at ways to improve this team, and no player is untouchable. I mean, you have some that are more likely to stay than others. Like I would say, like guys like Konechny and Travis Sanheim are as close to untouchable as you can get, although absolutely not untouchable. But like they are obviously open to wheel and deal. Like they're open to be third party brokers. We saw him get very creative on the Ivan Provorov deal with the LA Kings and Columbus Blue Jackets. I think that they're obviously open to adding players if it means helping the future. But I also think that they're not going to deviate off of course here. Like this still is a rebuild. I've had someone mention to me several times that, like, the discrepancy in the Eastern Conference between the teams in third place in the Metro and near the bottom, like, I haven't checked the point spread recently, but like, it's no more than 4 or 5 points that could shift you like several spots and really change the course of your season. So I don't think this is something that like a 25 game sample size is going to completely alter the plan that Keith Jones and Danny Briere have put into place here. I really think that this is going to be a team that stays the course. And maybe we don't see them offload every single UFA because I have heard that there is a danger to doing that. You've had John Tortorella come out and say, we've got the room right. And they're obviously playing really good hockey right now. So you don't want to just upset the apple cart just to add a third round draft pick. And I've also had someone with the team also mention that to me that like, what are the percentages of some of these mid-round picks ever hitting? Like something like 14% beyond like the first round or something like that. I should have written it down to be honest with you.
Right.
So like there is a danger of just kind of getting hot and heavy for accumulating any and all types of assets. But at the same time, there still is an eye on the future here. And I don't think this 25 game sample size isn't going to change anything philosophically for this management group.
Yeah, no, it certainly makes sense. I mean, the Flyers are 13, 10, and 2 right now for 28 points. I think even allowing for winning percentage, because the Flyers have some teams that not played as many games for them, I think they would be in a playoff spot right now. But again, that's kind of secondary right now, as you mentioned. There are players, though, in different categories, and I wanted to go through those players that I mentioned earlier who, and the designations are completely mine. So if you disagree with how I've categorized them, because I put them into 3 categories, one would be almost certainly gone or re-signed by the trade deadline and make a decision one way or another. The other category is likely gone by next season. So if something happens, it would likely happen in the off season. And then there's the nebulous category of could go either way, depending on what kind of offer they have and how many untouchables are there really. You mentioned a couple. I'm going to challenge you on at least one of those. So, but I want to talk about initially the players that are almost certainly gone or resigned by the trade deadline, in my humble opinion. Mark Stahl has had a rough time getting out of the gate. I don't know. I can't say I remember too much about his play before he had that rib injury, but since he's come back, he's really been awful. And they have a kind of unique agreement with him, however. They brought him in here. He played. I mean, he's just coming off a Stanley Cup final where he got significant minutes. So there is an understanding bringing this player in. And I wanted to talk to you about him and what you see happening and whether you think that designation that I put on him is correct.
That they'll make a decision by the trade deadline?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing in with Mark Stahl is, to your point, that he hasn't been great. I mean, his underlying numbers have been a bit better than the eye test would have suggested. Like, of all the defensemen this season, according to Evolving Hockey, he has the lowest expected goals against per 60 and the best expected goals for percentage overall. Now, I guess that maybe answers your question to how he was playing before he got hurt. Maybe the numbers have been skewed, and it's only 10 games, right? And a lot of these numbers only are applicable after a larger chunk. And there is such thing as the eye test. And the fact that he has by far averaged the least amount of ice time. I think he's down near less than 14 minutes per game, even more than Zamula was averaging. So the thing with Mark Stahl is that I could personally see him riding out the year here because maybe similar to what we saw with Justin Braun last season. The year before he gets dealt for a 3rd round pick, but last year maybe it was keeping him around or getting a 6th round pick. And I think that based on conversations I've had with people with the Flyers as early as last night, is that I don't know if they're going to make trades just for the sake of making trades and just getting X amount of assets at the risk of upsetting that room. It's really good right now. And one thing that was said to me last night that I found very interesting, but it was actually in regards to talking to about Cam Atkinson, but I think is applicable to Mark Stahl, is that they have a lot of good veterans in that room, a lot of good pros in that room. And because Stahl has kind of been like a fringe 6th defenseman, I'm not sure what kind of value he would get. And I think that maybe if you're the Flyers, you're saying, should we flip him for a 6th round pick, or should we just keep him around as like a passable number 6 defenseman until the end of the season and be that good pro for these young guys to lean on? So Stahl, I do think there would be interest in Stahl, but is that interest worth it for the Flyers to move on from him and not have that body on the back end?
Okay, so there's a tangible asset that could be there, but what is that asset? And versus the intangible of the things they're talking about that Tortorella has emphasized from the very first moment he stepped on the podium, right? In terms of culture, the room, and all that.
And look, like I've heard even Frank Cervalli talk about this on the DFO rundown, that this is a nightmare season for the Flyers because that team that's in a rebuild, the first technical year of the rebuild since they've openly said the word and embraced it, which a word that they weren't allowed to say under Dave Scott, but has been fully embraced by Dan Hilferty. But so I do get that from Frank's point of view by saying from on ice, it is kind of a nightmare of the season. But one thing that was said to me last night was that when they said rebuild, it was almost as much about the culture of the team as it was about compiling assets. And for as much of his damage as Chuck Fletcher did when he was here, I think that, and maybe you could apply this more to Brent Flair or attribute it more to Brent Flair because he still is here for a reason. One thing they did well under the Fletcher era was draft, especially given where they were drafting, the draft picks they had. And you're seeing a lot of like Brent Flair draft picks playing right now, whether it be Bobby Brink, Tyson Forster, Cam York. Owen Tippett was obviously acquired. Noah Cates was a Hextall pick, but Joel Farabee and Frost were also Hextall picks. But basically, you had a good crop of talent here, and a good crop of talent that was going to be part of this team for the future. And I think there's an inherent danger when you have that many young players around a toxic environment that get accustomed to losing. And I think that's why we saw during the Hextall era that kind of bled into the Fletcher era, why we saw so many younger promising players be so content with losing. We saw it with a young crop of Giroux and Coots and Chen and Voracek. And then that kind of got passed along to the Sanheims, the Konechnys, and the Provorovs. And Provorov was like a complete microcosm of maybe an overarching issue on a macro scale. So I do think that there is that there is that risk of not compiling an asset, but at the same time, like you mentioned, there are intangibles here that they believe, Tortorella specifically and others in that management group, that think are so important on an intangible scale and making the environment and the culture around the team feel better than it has in several years.
Okay. How does that apply to somebody like Nick Seeler? It's kind of savaged his career and become a valuable cog in the wheel, seemingly making his biggest contributions late in games when they're trying to nail them down, and also sticking up for his teammates. Again, not only the intangibles, I mean, his numbers are not bad, and he's playing on really a second pair right now with Walker. I don't know how long that's gonna remain that way, but he's been a valuable player for them. There's no doubt about it.
And it's been over a large sample size now. Like Nick Seeler has been playing at a very solid level going back to last season. So this isn't just a flash in the pan here, right? And he's at what, $775,000? If the Flyers retain half of that, someone could get him for less than $500,000. And I think that Nick Seeler is someone that has separated himself from a Mark Stahl because I think Nick Seeler has proven to be an everyday NHL defenseman based on a decent sample size here. You're well into a second season of him playing at this level, and he's playing at a higher level because now he's essentially the second left shot guy on their depth chart. Last year, he was like the third guy, and most nights he was playing as like your number 6. Now he's essentially been your number 4, although like him and Risto kind of split that duty of like the 4 or 5, depending on ice time and all that. But he's maintained a really solid level of play here alongside Sean Walker, and we can get into Walker later on. But I think Seeler has played himself into a part where it's just like the asset that you get for Nick Seeler is going to be worth it. Because like if Seeler maintains this level of play, and I know some people scoff at this, but as you get close to the deadline and Seeler has a 57 expected goals for percentage and a solid Corsi rating and all that, along with the intangibles of being a tough guy to play against, a type of defenseman that a lot of teams like to add going into a tough brand of hockey in the playoffs. And at that price tag, if it comes close to 3 p.m. on the NHL trade deadline and their other options are very scarce, maybe you see someone pony up a second round pick for Nick Seeler. So I think Nick Seeler is a guy that would fit into that under that what would you say, like
that category?
That category. There you go. Of that, there will be a decision on him between now and the deadline.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I go to hockey stat cards because I like things, condensed. We all do, but especially me, old timers like me. There's the hockey stat cards have like a game score. Now, is that comparable to like a WAR or an RAPM that you're aware of by any chance? I'm asking you and kind of catching you off guard.
Yeah, I mean, like by a stat card, do you mean like the stuff that like Jay Fresh does?
Yeah, it's hockeystatcards.com. And of course, I just refreshed it and took it off of the Flyers. But it's interesting because the top 5 guys, if I can get it back up here, in game score total are Konechny, Sean Walker, Couturier, Tyson Forster, and Nick Seeler. And I guess this is their contributions in all aspects of the game. And just the idea that Nick Seeler, and he's getting, he's 17 minutes a night, is at that level at 20.75. It's a number that like I really don't know how they came up with that number. But the idea that in something a lot of pundits are using right now, and I put them out after the games, is something I'm doing differently. And it kind of takes into the Corsi expected goals for against, and it's a mishmash, a casserole of all these numbers, and they throw it into a game score total. I don't know if it's something comparable to WAR or whatever, but the overriding point is the idea that Nick Seeler, from the vantage point of maybe 2 years ago, could be a top 5 in any category like that, just is a testament to what you're saying in terms of whether he could get a second or a late second or a third round pick or something like that.
And I think the role that he stepped into, because I was one of the main guys who was beating the drum of what are you going to do to replace the minutes of Ivan Provorov, a guy who ate a lot of PK minutes, a lot of D-zone starts, but in addition to the just incredible play and improvement of Travis Sanheim, I think Seeler has stepped into that role big time. And I think that you've seen him specifically on the penalty kill, along with Sean Walker and Sanheim, really be the cogs of that, like averaging the third amount of shorthanded time on ice per game among the defensemen, along with Cam York just behind him. So I think what he's been able to do, because if you look at his 5-on-5 play or ice time, I think it's only like 14 minutes per game or just under 15. But he's really made that jump, pardon me, and shown his value, in my opinion, in kind of like that shutdown role. And he is near the bottom in ozone start percentage among the consistent defensemen the Flyers have used this season. So could you say him and Walker have kind of been like that shutdown pair? Maybe. I think they've platooned that role pretty nicely with York and Sanheim. Both pairs have kind of shared the load on that front. But it's kind of crazy that, like you've mentioned, he's been able to separate himself from the pack and put him closer to the Walkers, Sanheims, and Yorks as opposed to the Stalls. And I guess you could say Risto, but he's only played 5 games, so it's a bit more difficult to like properly categorize him.
No, that makes sense. I mean, he's basically been pitch hitting for some of those grinding minutes that Risto would have got. And he stepped in. He's done such a good job that Risto didn't just step right back in. And even though Risto's been playing more or less kind of picking up where he left off last year. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The elephant in the room for a lot of people, and maybe the most valuable chip that the Flyers have to improve their draft prospects coming in this upcoming draft, in those 39 games, is Sean Walker, thinking that, okay, if he can maintain his level in terms on both sides of the puck, whether it's Corsi, expected goals, all those metrics, and just watching him play, I don't think it's impossible. Right-sided guy playing a lot of hard minutes, both sides of the puck, then he can get your first-round draft pick. I don't think it's crazy at all.
I don't think it's crazy at all either. And again, speaking with someone last night, that's what they're holding out for. And the other thing about this is that Walker's really enjoyed his time in Philadelphia. He's had a career renaissance of sorts. He obviously battled injuries in 21-22. Last year, battled his way back, didn't put up a lot of points. I think he's almost surpassed his point total from last year completely. And his I just checked this earlier today, like his career high in points, I believe, was 24 points in 2019-20, and he's almost there now. So, I mean, for Sean Walker, it's worked for him, and according to several people, including one of his teammates, like, I believe that he wants to stay with the Flyers. I think he likes the way it's jived with Philadelphia. Obviously, a favorite to John Tortorella. He's gotten a bigger opportunity than he's ever gotten before in LA. And LA was one of those teams, one of those rare teams with a plethora of right shot defensemen. So he was kind of buried there. So obviously it's going to depend on the price tag. He just turned 29, but I could also tell you that there's interest from the Flyers side, that the Flyers are interested and evaluating what, a potential fit for him longer term would look like. I think it's too premature to talk about what a contract could be. Like, we could speculate and look at comps. I quickly looked at some comparables, and it is tough because we're basing a 25-game sample size of Sean Walker versus other guys with more of a long-term, history.
A track record.
A track record. But, I mean, at this point in time, and this is completely speculative, so this is me reporting. I haven't heard numbers or term. Just off the top of my head, you're probably looking at something in the 4x4 range. And if he's playing this way, I don't think that's completely off base. But at the same time, I've had two other GMs from other teams tell me to this point that, a first round pick is not something that Sean Walker could fetch at this juncture. But as you get closer to the deadline, like, we see first round picks get tossed around. Like, is Sean Walker worse than David Savard was when he got traded to the Tampa Bay Lightning? Is he worse than Josh Manson was when he got traded to the Colorado Avalanche? Obviously, those are different types of players. Those are the typical, like, rugged, stay-at-home physical types that a lot of GMs get hot and heavy for going into the playoffs. But still, the right shot factor and that he's a top 4 defenseman all day long, as one person said to me, I think he's turning heads. I wouldn't put it out of the world of possibility that he fetches a first-round pick by any stretch.
No, not at all. And considering that Manson had been struggling for a couple of years before he got moved.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
there's right. And the other factor is, what does the draft look like? The draft last year, I would say, probably not going to cut it. But this draft is not that deep, doesn't have the quality that we had last year, which is probably going to go down as one of the better drafts in the last 30 years. I think the value of that pick is a little bit less. So, being a fan for so long, I'm thinking strategically that the Flyers, if they're going to overachieve this year, one of the protections against that and one of the downsides that you can overcome is that they can accumulate first-round picks. They can move up in this draft to get into that prime area and get that center or more than likely in this draft, defenseman that they really need. They need in my mind, they need a first-pairing defenseman who's an alpha dog. They're number one, and a couple centers, but going forward. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. When we're talking about Walker, Anthony, I'm thinking to myself, okay, let's do a little projection for next year. Who's going to be here? You think about Sanheim, you think about York. Sealer and Stahl are not going to be here next year. We hope Emil Andre will be ready for a role with this team because the power play could use that. You're going to need another veteran. And would you, considering the way Tortorella talked about being aggressive and getting ready for the mad Russian, Matvei Michkov, and wanting to play a certain way, which is aggressive, taking some chances. Okay. What player going forward matches that better than Sean Walker on their roster? And if you're saying to yourself, yeah, but they can't have too many older defensemen, then I'm thinking, well, then Ristolainen could be an odd man out if there's a market for him. So there's a lot of ifs here. There's a lot of provisos that have to go right. But is there a scenario where the Flyers could be wanting to keep Walker and may decide that Ristolainen is the guy, whether it's not necessarily before the trade deadline, but in the offseason that the Flyers want to move on from?
I think you're bang on with that. And I do think what happens with Sean Walker will be at least somewhat dependent on what happens with Rasmus Ristolainen. And look, I like Ristolainen. Obviously, I've been one of his advocates for a while. I think that now there's tangible evidence on the ice that he can be an effective hockey player. I've spoken to several people across the league, and I think the general consensus is that as of today, with the cap as is, he's probably overpaid by $1 million, $1.5 million. Ristolainen's a $3.5, $4 million player, a 4-5 defenseman that does have value. But I think that at this juncture, Ristolainen is a luxury that the Flyers can't afford and a luxury that they don't necessarily need. And I think that for a lot of teams looking to bolster their blue line going into the playoffs, there is a market for Ristolainen, especially when you see what other defensemen of his ilk get in free agency. Like, teams are going to go out and give Eric Branson 4/4. Teams are going to go out and give Ben Sherratt 4.75 over 4 years. It happens all the time. Josh Manson, I would make the case that as of today, that I'm not talking about historically, but today, Ristolainen's a better defenseman than Josh Manson. Is that a stretch to say at this juncture?
I think the offensive side for Manson may be a little higher, but yeah, I mean, if you're talking about what they've got, not from their history, but from here on out, the idea that Risto has discovered something, is onto something, it could at least match it, and it's quite possible with a even better tool set that he could be a better player. Now, I don't think it's crazy.
And the other thing I've heard about Risto, and I know I always come off as like a Risto defender, but with all his haters, I think that he deserves someone to be in his corner. One thing that was brought up to me is that out of all the coaches he had in Buffalo, I don't think one single of those coaches, after they lost their job in Buffalo, coached another game in the NHL as a head coach. And that coaching was a massive, massive issue for Ristolainen early in his career. So, I mean, I would have to really go back, but I mean, I think Dan Bylsma was his first coach, or maybe it was Ted Nolan. Neither of those guys were head coaches ever again. You had Phil Housley, you had Ralph Kruger. Don Granato has worked out decently in Buffalo, but I mean, he still is on his first rodeo as a head coach. So I think that just dumbing down Risto's game a bit, having him not chase hits. And one thing I heard about him was keeping his stick on the ice, because he has a big stick, he has a long stick, and just by osmosis, sometimes he's going to break up plays because of his size. And you hear a lot of teams talk about, getting that Eric Chernak type, getting an Eric Chernak type, a Josh Manson type, a right shot. And I've heard that a lot when it comes to, let's say, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And those guys don't grow on trees. So it's are you going to maybe just try and wait and try and get one in free agency? Or do you have a chance to basically add a defenseman like that on a 3-year contract who's only 29 years old? It's not like he's 33 or he's signed into his mid-30s. It's going to expire by the time he's 33 years old. And by that point, the cap is going to be well over $90 million. I think that there slowly is starting to be a market for Ristolainen. Now, is he going to get a first-round pick, a second-round pick, or what? All this? I doubt it. But I look at a team like Toronto, who I believe that they have internal interest in Ristolainen. I could tell you 100% they have not talked to the Flyers. So there has been no trade talks that have materialized to this point. But I'm pretty certain that Toronto internally likes the player. I look at a team like the Winnipeg Jets, who have Dylan DeMello as a pending UFA defenseman, and Brendan Dillon, although he's a left shot as a pending UFA defenseman, they always struggle to find players to commit to that team long term. And I believe they were one of the teams that were hot and heavy about Risto when he was still with the Buffalo Sabres. And then I look at the Calgary Flames, who just traded Zadorov, who, although he's a left shot, brings a lot of the same attributes and plugs more or less the same hole as Aristo, as a 4-5 physical type. You're probably going to have to trade Chris Tanev. You're probably going to have to trade Noah Hannafin. That's a team that can't go into a full rebuild because of the contracts to Kadri, Huberdeau, and Uyghur. Is that a team that says, okay, 3-year contract, $5 million, we get a commitment to a guy who has proven to be a solid 4-5 defender, slightly overpaid, but will look better as the years go on and the cap jumps? I think that the market might be bigger than we once thought for a guy like Ristolainen. And we all know that his style of play is something that's coveted during playoff time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's the bottom line with that. If you have any doubts, the idea that they want a big, rugged guy who plays grinding minutes into the playoffs, which more minutes in the playoffs are like that. So, yeah, and I probably could have moved Risto into one of those other categories. I had him in it could go either way. But before we get into that category, let's talk about players I don't think are going to be here for one reason or another next season. And I could be wrong. I mean, I'm kind of hearing some different things that are changing my impression just on your comments so far. But why don't we start out with veteran Cam Atkinson? And, he's kind of, I thought he's come back a little bit the last couple games, but after like an early adrenaline rush of getting back to playing and being out all year, getting a fusion on his neck, and he started out real well, he's really hit a wall. And there are some nights you barely know he's playing. He's come back a little bit, hasn't scored yet. What's your opinion of where he'll be next year? Will he be in Philly?
It's tough. Like, we know that he's a Tortorella guy. And like I was talking about earlier, I brought up Cam Atkinson specifically because I said, is he someone that maybe you try and retain money on, move him at the deadline, try and get like some type of an asset for him? But I think the Flyers really like the veteran leadership that he brings. Obviously, like I just mentioned, he goes back long time with Tortorella to Columbus. And retention, I think, for the Flyers is something that they want to reserve for those pending UFAs, because then next year you still have those slots, and they already have a long-term slot tied up with Kevin Hayes. So if you retain salary on Atkinson, then you would be going into next season with only one retention spot left. Now, I think that he's going to be with the team past the deadline, because I think he falls into that stall category of, like, even if you retain 50%, what are you going to get for Cam Atkinson? And that would still be a team requiring to commit almost $3 million to him going into next season. So it wouldn't be anything that needle moving. But going into next year, I think, is a different conversation. I'm of the, and this is not me reporting it, I haven't heard it. I asked about this going into last summer and it was quickly shot down. I'm of the belief that they should buy out Cam Atkinson, just because I don't think that he's kind of a pariah from an on-ice perspective. You don't really know where to put him, how to use him. He's a right wing, an undersized right wing. They have a plethora of right wings, so much so that you have Tippett and Forster playing the left side. He's an undersized guy, which I know they want to get bigger. They're a very small team up front, aside from like their bottom three forwards and Paling, Delorier, and Hathaway. I just don't really see a fit for this guy. And this is not me saying he's a bad player. I know he missed a year to injury. I know he's a really good pro, and I have a lot of empathy for that, and like trying to, reason with him bringing a lot of intangibles here. But while I think he will finish out the season here, just because of it's just more worth it to keep him for the intangibles as opposed to trading him for pennies on the dollar or just peanuts, I have a hard time reasoning with him being here next year, because next season you would save over $3 million in cap space, actually over 3.5, and then you'd have 1 year of a 1.75 dead cap hit following the buyout. So, I mean, that's what I would do. But to this point, I think they really appreciate what he brings in the room.
Gotcha. Yeah. To me, it depends on his production. He's got to pick it up, and maybe he's kind of needs a second win right now. And if the last couple games against the Penguins are any indication, it looks like he's turning in that direction. Let's just see what happens. But yeah, they have a plethora of right wings, and they have Gauthier. He's going to kick somebody back over to the side, so you can see everything the way things are going. The pieces are falling in place. That might be an augur. A certain direction for Cam Atkinson. Okay, let's get into some younger players that I don't think are going to be here next year. Unless the Flyers are open to moving Scott Lawton. We're talking about culture, okay? I don't think Ryan Poehling has done enough so far to be back next year, except maybe attract other suitors that are looking for a fourth line center. What say you?
I mean, Poehling, I think, is probably going to be a guy that lingers around potentially just because of his size. They're a team that I think they really want to get bigger down the middle of the ice, and he is on the bigger side of things, 6'2". I think he's a serviceable bottom six center, probably better suited for a fourth line role. Obviously, $1.4 million ticket. Maybe that's someone who comes around and kicks tires on him. I do know that it was reiterated to me last night that they still feel that they're very thin down the middle of the ice.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Poehling even maybe gives them that opportunity to flirt with Noah Cates as a left wing. It was mentioned to me last night that his last game he played before getting injured, he was playing left wing. So I think
Yes, you saw the
Poehling,
difference.
yeah, and I'm of the belief that Noah Cates should be a left wing, but I do understand that he played very well down the middle of the ice last year, and Torts really likes him there. But I think Poehling being around gives you that flexibility to play Cates on the left wing or play Lawton on the left wing. And I think we've seen a major difference in Lawton's game this year, playing full-time center as opposed to last year where he spent so much time on the wing. So, I mean, I'm not sure where things are at with Poehling, but I do know that his size and the fact that he just plays center in general has given them a lot more of flexibility throughout the lineup and just more size down the middle in general.
Okay, I think he's been their best face-off man. That's one area that Sean Couturier struggled in his comeback. So there's that as well, you know?
Yeah, no, for sure. And like, look, this is the down the middle of the ice is like there's no help coming either, which is tough. Like, I mean, Denwye, I think, hit a sophomore slump. I think he's coming around now, but he's going to need all of Lehigh, all of the season in Lehigh, if not a bit longer, to get acclimated properly to the pro level. Beyond that, like, I mean, is Cutter a center? Who knows? We've both expressed our concerns about that. And then
Yeah.
after those two, like, you have some guys who could be diamonds in the rough, like a Denver Barkey or Cole Knuble, but like they don't have a lot coming here. They really don't have a lot coming in the way of, impact centermen. So, I mean, it kind of again falls back to the argument that I made to open the show is like, is it worth it to trade Ryan Poehling for a fourth round draft pick, or is it better for you to just keep him around and allow him to provide you with that flexibility and some different attributes and size and face-off ability that you don't otherwise have?
Okay, makes sense. Two other younger players. Before we get to the hot button, Igor Zamula has had his struggles. Now, he's a guy who's really going to benefit from this next 39 game period. I don't anticipate that he'll be moved before the trade deadline or anything like that. I do anticipate that he's going to be in and out of the lineup. And I'm not sure what his future is right now. I'm totally up in the air. What are your impressions?
I think that Zamula's foot speed has been something that has concerned Tortorella a bit. I like the way he defends the rush because of his stick, but I think I think that's the thing that has always caught my attention about him is that he's very good at breaking up plays when it comes at him over the blue line. But when the play starts to get to a pace that's too much is where he kind of loses himself. And you look at some of the underlying numbers and, with the exception of Emile Andre, he's tracked as arguably the worst defenseman this season, kind of at that same level as Louis Belpedio. but we know what Belpedio is, and you're hoping for more from Zamula. And I think that's why when you have the argument of him versus Stahl from an on-ice perspective this season, not to say Stahl has been great, but I think that he's been better than Zamula. And I do know that they still view Zamula as like a younger guy, but eventually you have to wonder when the racetrack is going to run out for him. Because you have some guys in the minors, whether that be like an Adam Ginning, an Emil Andre, although Andre kind of shoots higher than what Zamula projects to be. But let's say from a third pairing perspective, Addard, Ginning, Helgi Grans. I don't track the Phantoms very closely, but those are three names that are kind of consistently tied to potential future third pair guys. And I just wonder that if by the time the season comes to an end, if he's still in and out of the lineup with Mark Stahl and his play isn't on found a more consistent pace, will some of the internal options have passed him by? And I like Zamula, and I do think that this is one of the situations where I've kind of disagreed with Torts, where it's just like, just give him a stretch of games. Why does Mark Stahl need to play? Like, why are you drawing them in and out of the lineup? But at the same time, what's his ceiling? Like, I've always said that his ceiling was a left shot Justin Braun. And those kind of guys you can, not to say they grow on trees, but they're not going to make or break your team.
Yeah, and he's not going to give you those intangibles like Justin Braun either. So,
Exactly.
Yeah, my only concern with whatever he is, he's probably, if he can hang around in the league, I don't think he'll be much more than a steady Eddie. But he could grow into a nice defensive defenseman. I think it's going to take until he's like about 26 or 27, right?
Yeah.
So that's the problem because he's 23 now. So that's like 3-4 years. I just don't think the ceiling is high enough considering the internal options you're talking about with Adder, Jennings, Andre, and Bonk and others on the way. So yeah.
Yeah, and like I think that he will eventually find a footing in the NHL as like maybe like a 5-6 all defense type of guy. And I do think there's value in that. And like I said, I think that he has kind of been slighted by Torts a bit. Like, why are you like, I just don't get the point of switching him back and forth with Mark Stahl. But at the same time, when he has been in for stretches of games, he hasn't overly impressed me. So it's kind of a weird spot with Zamula. I want him to get more playing time, but I also think he struggled to force them to give him more playing time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm seeing the same things you are. I like the zone entry denials, and I like the fact that with the puck he can really be creative. But sometimes what he's thinking and what he's actually able to do, the processing is just not there at the NHL level yet. So we'll have to see. But enough about Igor. We got to talk about Morgan Frost. I don't think he's going to be here next year, but he's got 39 games to straighten out things, and he got a break in a way with the break of Noah Cate's foot. And I think it's do or die right now for Morgan Frost.
Yeah, Morgan Frost continues to be one of the more polarizing guys on this team. I mean, if you look at the way his process is, I feel like he's just been mid across the board. He's had really good games. He's had very meh games. Overall, I think he's just been a very average player. But I think that what we've seen is they hold Morgan Frost to a higher standard. And for him to get those consistent minutes, now he's obviously getting them because Cates is out, but they want him to be an impact player each and every night. And I don't think he is that. I think that the new power play configuration is something that they should run with for a while here because he is their best facilitator down the middle of the ice and probably their best left shooting facilitator overall. So he could play that Voracek role on the half wall. But it's just tough for me because it's also similar to Zamula, but on like notched up a few pegs. Is that like I think a lot of the time Tortorella has been too on his case and been unfair with him, but at the same time, he hasn't done anything to completely defend the player. Like Frost has yet to put together a stretch of games where I'm just like, okay, like now it's like you're giving them no reason to take you out. Like if they take you out now, it's a personal thing. He still has games and stretches of play where it's just like, dude, what are you doing? Because you see the way Morgan Frost can get creative below the hash marks or from a stationary position on the half wall. And you're like, there is so much skill in there. There is a player in there that provides a skill set and attributes that quite literally no other player in the system, on the team, in Lehigh, in junior, in college, overseas, provides them right now. Down the middle of the ice, a creative guy with that much of offensive instinct, but he doesn't do it enough on a day-to-day basis. Now, I can tell you they're not going to give Morgan Frost away. He's a guy that they still see value in, still a developing player. They're not just going to move him for a draft pick. But another thing is that he's under cost certainty until 2025 at a reasonable cap hit. Even if he isn't a 50-point player, he's making what, $2.75 million or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very reasonable contract for what he provides you. But actually, it's 2.1, so it's even less than that. He's making less than Noah Cates. So, $2.1 million for a guy that even if he gives you 40 points is a very, very digestible number. But if the opportunity presents itself to trade him for another player that is in need of a change of scenery, I think they would certainly jump on that opportunity. I just don't think the value league-wide for Morgan Frost is there right now. Enough for the Flyers to just dump him, because they're not just going to do it to just move on from him or get a draft pick. If they're trading them, if they're going to trade a guy like him, they want fair value. And I've been told very recently that they don't believe that value is quite there yet.
No, well, he's got to build it up. And I think there's the other side of the equation we can't ignore. The player nor his agent can't be happy right now. Right. So
no, for sure not. And I do think it's fair to point out that Frost himself has been a really good teammate through all this, has taken it in stride. But, it's human nature. You're not going to be very happy always at the center of these types of, maybe not controversial talks, but polarizing talks. I think that it has affected him at times. And I don't think the agent has done the player any favors. I think it's been a rather contentious relationship between him and Flyers management, going back to the negotiations over the summer. I think that the agent tried to force the Flyers to trade Morgan Frost, but the Flyers still value Morgan Frost, just maybe not to the same level as the agent.
Yeah, you just have to wonder what Tortorella is going to be like if they don't move him before the trade deadline, which I don't see. But when they're talking over the offseason and they're looking at getting draft picks or any kind of asset, I have to think that Tortorella is going to weigh in. And I don't think Keith Jones is a big fan of Morgan Frost. I don't know. I don't see him coming back next year, but we'll see. Should be interesting to watch. It's a soap opera. There's no doubt about it. Now we're in that third category of players. We talked about Risto. I think we kind of covered that player. Could go either way, but I have a couple here, and maybe we could go quick hits because it's so speculative at this point. I don't want to go crazy, but both Travis Konechny, now you mentioned more or less untouchable. You think they're going to re-sign him? That's what I'm gathering from you?
Look, they're still going to listen on Travis Konechny. He's not completely untouchable. They listened on him over the summer. I just don't know if they're ever going to get the value that they believe is fair for Travis Konechny. I think that he's a guy that's really bought in. I think he's by far their best player. I think he's the only player on their roster that you could say is a slam dunk first player on pretty much every team in the NHL, even if it's like a lower end first liner, but I think he is proven to be that. I mean, if someone shows up and blows their socks off, like again, this is completely speculative, but like I look at a team like the Florida Panthers, who really tried to go hard for Patrick Kane to play on a secondary line with Sasha Barkov, and with them potentially losing Sam Reinhart to free agency this year, Konechny being under contract for another year, $5.5 million. Could that make sense for the Florida Panthers? Like if the Panthers come in and give you like a can't miss offer, maybe including a centerman like an Anton Lundell, maybe you pounce on that. But to this point, the Flyers haven't gotten anything that they think is fair value for Konechny. And I do think that if he gets to this summer, you're probably looking at an extension. What that extension could look like, I think the ballpark is the Timo Meier contract, which I believe they were drafted in the same year, if I'm not mistaken. I think they were both 2015 players.
I believe so. Konechny and Timo Meyer, I believe so.
Yeah, Meyer, I believe, went like 9th overall, and Konechny was 26 or whatever, or
Mhm.
24. So I mean, I think that, and again, this is very premature. This was very light conversations I had with someone about it, but I think that would be your ballpark. And maybe they, with the cap going up a bit, maybe you get into that $9.25 million AAV. But
Mm.
again, this isn't saying that this is a slam dunk to happen. They have it all organized, and as soon as July 1 hits, they're hitting them with an extension. This is still a team that is in a position to listen on everybody, as Darren Dreger alluded to, and Konechny is one of those guys. I just think that he's going to be of the tougher, if not the toughest, pry off this team.
Gotcha. How about Scott
And
Lawton?
I do want to say that I think that, and again, this is mostly speculative. I think that of all the players on this roster, he's probably the best chance to be the next captain.
Okay. Well, he's certainly leading by example.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Scott Lawton, I just mentioned him. There's the cultural element, but his play's not been there. They purportedly had an opportunity to get a first-round draft pick last offseason. Where does he stand? Because he's in that category. Could go either way.
Scott Lawton, I think, was the one type of play, or the one situation where I think they really missed the boat. And I get it that, he's the only player to have worn a letter under the Tortorella era. He's continued to be the only player to wear a letter under the Tortorella era. The de facto captain, in a lot of ways, had a career year last year. I think they really made a mistake. Personally, I do understand the whole cultural aspect, but at the same time, I think that as opposed to Konechny, where his value was going to stay at where it was or potentially even increase, I think Lawton peaked last year. And you had a chance to move $3 million out of your bottom six, and they didn't do it. And look, I'm not going to sit here and, chastise them for that. I have a lot of respect for Scott Lawton. I think he's done a lot for that culture. And we can't really fairly speak on what he means to that team because we're not in the room. So for all we know, it would have been a catastrophic loss for that room. But from an on-ice roster perspective, I think they really missed the boat because I don't know if they're ever going to have a chance to get a first-round pick for Scott Lawton ever again. And then at that point, does it slide back into that category of like, well, is it worth it to just get a middle round pick and severely affect your culture, as opposed to a first round pick? I think then you could have seriously justified like, okay, the culture is going to take a hit, but now we have 3 first round picks in 2022 or 2023 as it was. So it's an unfortunate situation because I really do like the player, but I think that it was maybe a missed opportunity.
Mm-hmm. I could still see him rallying and getting up to a second round pick level for a playoff team. It just, then we address the other issues, the cultural intangibles that you just talked about. How about Garnet Hathaway? He's done a really good job here. He competes every night. His numbers aren't the best, but you notice him out there all the time. And he's that spark. He's that someone who could be a catalyst, not necessarily through talent, but through compete level effort, being a pest. And he can chuck them too.
Yeah, I mean, I think Hathaway has historically been one of the better fourth liners in the NHL, especially one that brings that sandpaper and that toughness. I think you still see a lot of teams try and go out and get that type of element. Like you saw what the Leafs gave up for Ryan Reeves, and that has just been a catastrophic failure to this point because the game has passed him by and he was never a great player to begin with. But Hathaway is one of those guys that still is a fourth line player. And I think that maybe hasn't had his best season in Philly, but it's still an effective one. And maybe this is a guy that is more attractive for a team next year when he's in the final year of his deal. But I mean, I could certainly see Hathaway back because I think they really like what guys like Deslauriers and Hathaway give them on their fourth line.
Okay. Another one of the other elephants in the room, Carter Hart. Samuel Ursan's playing lights out after a rough start. You give Ursan decent amount of interval in between starts instead of waiting every 3 weeks or what have you. And he can look really good. Is that good enough for the Flyers to cash in on Carter Hart? Or is Carter Hart getting to the point where, hey, no, we're not passing up a chance to finally settle in on a goaltender? And how would Carter Hart feel about that?
It's tough because with the Hockey Canada stuff looming, it feels like nobody wants to touch him. And again, I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I think that there's a very good possibility that Carter Hart would not be here right now if not for the Hockey Canada stuff. And I do think that he's a guy that the Flyers look at along with all the other goaltending pieces they have in their system, specifically Urson, and say, like, we could cash in here on Carter Hart. Like, we look at how much that Provorov deal helped the Flyers. One trade. You know, you get Oliver Bonk, who almost instantly becomes your top defensive prospect. You get an additional second round pick this year. You have Sean Walker, who may parlay into another first round pick. Helgi Grans, who could be a nice piece moving forward. And it wasn't even that monumental of a trade. We know what Ivan Provorov was. I think they look at Carter Hart and say, this could be like the absolute cash cow for us. And I do think that they had very serious conversations with other teams regarding Carter Hart this summer. But I think there's a lot of hesitation from other teams to touch this guy until there's some form of a resolution with Hockey Canada. So it's tough for me to even go beyond that, because I think until there's some kind of resolution with the Hockey Canada stuff, he's not going to go anywhere because no other team wants to take that risk from a PR standpoint.
And what does that mean for the Flyers with an arbitration eligible RFA? That puts them in a spot, you know?
Well, that's the other point here, is that, like, he is a pending free agent, and what is he going to command? And I think that there's a very strong case to be made that Carter Hart could try and push his chips into the middle here and cash in big time. Like, goalie contracts are always harder to compare, but I mean, I look at a guy like Jordan Binnington when he signed 6/6, and he obviously had a Stanley Cup pedigree, but he signed during COVID, during a flat cap era. I mean, I think he was how old was Jordan Binnington when he signed that deal? I'm trying to look it
He
up
was
now.
older. I think
He's
he was like
30.
26 when he did that. Let
Yeah,
me
he was
check
like
that out.
26, 28. But yeah, because he signed that bridge deal. So obviously he got to the party a bit later. Carter Hart is obviously only 25 years old, but I mean, if you're going long term with Carter Hart, I think you're creeping into that $7 million category. Like, between the cap going up and him being younger, so buying up more UFA years. I mean, I think that that's kind of where your brain is going when you're talking about a potential extension for Carter Hart. And are you going to want to commit that to Carter Hart when you have Samuel Urson, you have Kolosov, you have a guy in Carson Bjarnason? Like, if Fedotov is ever a factor here, but I think that's very much a question mark. You still do have Felix Sandstrom, who I know that they like as a backup option. And I mean, goaltending depth in the NHL is more important than ever here. So, I mean, it's a very weird situation on several levels, but until they have a resolution with the Hockey Canada stuff, it's hard to really give a definitive answer as to where this could go.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I think we nailed it with that 26, 27 for Bennington when he signed that deal. But before we wrap, just a couple honorable mentions. Just with the Nick Delorier, really, last couple games when they played Pittsburgh and they would get trapped in their zone, that fourth line was just getting cratered. And a guy who looked really useless out there and maybe should not be dressing every game was Nick Delorier. And I know he's a cultural statement in and of himself, but there does come a point at which you say, hey, you know what? We don't need him every game.
Yeah, and I think Nick Delorier, he's 32 now. He's starting to get on the older side. Like, him too. Like, I mean, he's always been a passable hockey player in addition to being tough as nails and able to fight anyone. And I think that's why you saw him get that 4-year contract. Like, I always say this, in a world where Ryan Reeves gets 3 years at $1.4 million, it makes sense why Delorier got 4 years at $1.75 million. That's just, there's always going to be someone who overpays for that toughness. The Flyers are obviously in a position that they can pay Delorier $1.75 million. But I do think that his game has taken a dip this year. I thought last year he was actually surprisingly good, like better
Mhm.
than expected from like a hockey aspect. But I do think that maybe that fourth line has a bit too much grit, too much sandpaper, as opposed to last year. You had him playing with more skilled guys at times, like whether that was like Wade Allison or Tanner Lazinski or what have you. So, I mean, he probably shouldn't be playing every night, but at the same time, it's like who else is going to play a fourth line left wing role? And that's kind of like what I come back to is that like what player is Nick Delorier blocking? And I look in the minors and I'm like, if I call up Ollie Lexell, I don't want him playing that role. Like,
No, but Lawton could drop down and play on that,
yeah,
you know.
that's a good like when they're fully healthy, like Lawton, Paling, Hathaway is probably the fourth line I would want. That like,
Right.
and then depending on who you're playing, maybe you take Paling out, you shift Lawton to the middle. And I think Scott Lawton is just a significantly more effective player when he's playing on the wing. To me, he looks like a completely different guy. I don't know about you.
I think he's a better winger with more skilled players. With less skilled players, I don't think it matters as much. It's just he's not very good on faceoffs, so sometimes that that can hurt you. But if Paling's on a wing, he can take a faceoff. It's not going to move the needle either way. One last one, just because there have been so many issues with the player, even more so than Frost in a way, is Joel Farabee does not want to leave the Flyers, and John Tortorella is not going to lead the chorus to get him out of town. But they've had some significant incidents the last couple of years.
It's a weird situation with Farabee because there are games and there are stretches of play where he looks like one of the better players. I think that, you look at his expected goals for percentage, aside from Tyson Forster, who's only 0.10% ahead of him, he's their top guy in that regard. I think his underlying process has been solid. I thought he got off to a really, really good start this season. But then there's other times where he does disappear. And I think he's pointless in a lot of games. I think it's like 4 or 5 games he hasn't even registered a point. And for me, Joel Farabee is a guy where like I don't really know what he is. Like he's kind of like a jack of all trades, a master of none. And that is it's an asset in a lot of ways, but it also could be a detriment because you could find a $5 million guy playing on your third line. And I wonder if they're going to, and I don't know if it has to be one or the other, but I wonder if eventually they're going to get to a point where they prioritize an Owen Tippett instead of a Joel Farabee as like that secondary player making that like mid-range salary. I do think that eventually they're going to sign Tippett long-term from what I've heard, as long as the price is right. And I think that price tag is probably going to come in that like upper 5s, low 6 tier. Like, I mean, if you sign Tippett 6/6, that's pretty much the going rate for a guy who is trending to be like a consistent like 27, 28 goal scorer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, I mean, if I'm committing $6 million to Owen Tippett, who is somewhat settled in as like that second line left wing, secondary power play option, do I have a use for Joel Farabee? And I think that, and I haven't heard this. This is just completely my own brain talking. But I wonder if, like, okay, you can, let's just say hypothetically, you commit to Travis Konechny, you commit to Owen Tippett, you have Bobby Brink, who is maybe your third line right wing going forward. You have Tyson Forster in your top 6. Then
Gautier's
eventually,
coming.
what's that?
Gautier's coming. He could end up on wing.
Yeah, Mitchkov's coming. After a certain point, like, is Noah Cates maybe your third line left wing long term? Like, that's when I start to say, like, is there a fit for Joel Farabee? Like, off the top of my head, like, is it out of the realm of possibility that in like 12 to 15 months from now, your third line is Cates, Denway, and Bobby Brink? Like, that's kind of like a prototypical third line that you're going to look for, right? You have some skill, you have some speed, but you also have some defensive awareness. Your second line is maybe Owen Tippett. I don't know. Owen Tippett, Morgan Frost, if he's still here, and Tyson Forster or Sean Couturier. Like, I don't know where, I have a struggle finding where Joel Farabee fits. And that's going to be even more of a concern once Cutter Gauthier shows up, especially if Cutter Gauthier is a left wing. There's no fit for Joel Farabee, like at all, because you can't tell me that you're going to be paying $5 million for a third line left wing.
And yet he is a nice piece that could help them maybe get a second line center or not necessarily a first pairing defenseman, but maybe another second pairing defenseman. Yeah, possibilities are there.
And I think that the Flyers again have a lot of guys that fit that Joel Farabee tier in terms of their ceilings. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
It's a similar profile. Yeah.
yeah,
Different
like
styles, but yeah.
yeah, like in the sense of like that, like where they could reach. Like I think that is like Joel Farabee is a guy that like his tier is very attainable for a lot of the guys they have, whether that be Denwye, like I guess Allison, the game has passed him by, but it's just a very it's a bizarre tier that I find that they find themselves in right now with Joel Farabee.
No, that's a good point. So I think obviously that's something they would look at in the offseason, if at all, and maybe not this offseason, but maybe a following one. That'll be definitely bear watching. And we're going to wrap it there. I think we've accomplished what we set out to do. I don't know if we've really settled anything, but we have those 39 games before the trade deadline, which is on March 8th. We'll go from there. So why don't you tell the folks where people can catch up to you and see your work and what you got coming up?
So yeah, I actually have a story dropping later today, or by the time that this podcast drops, maybe it will already be up, but on Sean Walker and what his future could hold along with Risto. Obviously stick to hockey with Jason Martinez, sparingly on Brotherly Pod as my schedule fills up. And every Wednesday on TSN 690 in Montreal at 11:35. So yeah, busy, but I'm glad that we had the time to link up here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And really appreciate it. Just a round of the O&B Puckcast. You can find us on Twitter or the app formerly known as Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. Follow us on Apple, Spotify, and the other outlets. Rate it and subscribe. We really do appreciate it. As I mentioned earlier, it moves us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts. And with that, everybody, until next time, I think we're going to be back with Kevin Kurz making his debut on the O&B Puckcast on Wednesday the 13th. Until then, take care.